Rosie here. Welcome back to my channel, and you might notice, if you're returning, that we're not sitting on the couch in front of the same white wall. Instead, we're in front of my white kitchen. But that's because today I thought I would do a bit of a different video format, and I'm going to bake cookies while reviewing a book. So the book I'm going to review today is Prairie Fires, The American Dreams of Laura Ingalls Wilder by Caroline Fraser. And I thought, you know what? For some reason, I'm kind of afraid of doing like a one book video review. I don't know why. I feel like I wouldn't have enough to say, or like it wouldn't be interesting. Who knows? For some reason, I decided to make it more complicated because apparently that's a good way to alleviate fear, and bake what are allegedly Laura Ingalls Wilder's molasses cookies while I do it. I offer no guarantee of truth to this recipe, but I got it from, what's her name? I got it from Tori Abbey's blog. I'll link it down below. It showed up when I googled like Laura Ingalls Wilder recipes. So we're gonna try that. I've seen a few of these like baking and books videos. I don't know if anyone originated it or like a lot of people just think, hey, this is cool. I like baked goods. I like books. Let's smush them together. But yeah, let me know what you think of this format. I'm gonna give it a go. We'll see how it works. See if I get hopelessly confused trying to talk while doing things. But I should have lots of time because to make things hard for myself, I decided to do it like old-fashioned, like she would have, instead of with my stand mixers. But yeah, so we're gonna do this the hard way, and I'm sure my arms will be tired by the end. Oh, this spoon has a crack in it. Let's crack it with a different, uncracked spoon. Right, so here's the setup. We've got sort of your usual cookie ingredients, your butter, sugar, flour, vanilla, egg. Then here's the more like specific ones. We've got oats, dried coconut, soaking in water because the recipe says to do that, so we're doing that. Whole bunch of spices and like leavening agents, and molasses. So the first step is to cream the sugar and the butter, which I'm dreading. I have such weak little arms. But you know what, we're gonna do it. And while we do that, I'm gonna give you a brief overview of Laura's life and who she was, in case you don't know. So Laura Ingalls Wilder was born Laura Ingalls in 1867 in, I think my notes say Wisconsin, so in Wisconsin apparently. And she and her family moved a lot as kids. They were, when she was a child. They sort of continually moved west-ish. There was some backtracking east, but like on the whole, they were continually moving west with the American frontier, trying to find viable agricultural land and build a profitable farm. So that was her life. Like, again, if you don't know, she's like quintessential covered wagons, girls in sunbonnets on the prairies type person. So sort of throughout the 1870s and 1880s, she and her family were constantly trying to establish farms in new areas, and honestly, it was very much like a life on the brink of poverty type situation. They were not well off. They were doing this to try and establish financial security. And from a very young age, she was very much involved with that. She started working when I think she was like 9 years old. She had her first paying job to help support the family and basically never stopped. And then in the late 1880s, when she was like, I think 17, she married her husband, Almanzo, and at that point they were in South Dakota. Sorry if this is rambly, it's turning out to be quite hard, but she and her husband, Almanzo, who was another settler frontiersman in the South Dakota area, got married. And they continued to try and make it work there for several years. They had a daughter who was named Rose, and then eventually they just couldn't make it work. They were flat broke, and they decided to move back further east and give it a go there. That was during the 1894 recession. There was, I think, drought. Maybe it was just a recession. I should have taken more detailed notes. But basically they moved east. They moved to Missouri with their young daughter. And from that point on started the slow and painful climb out of poverty, basically. In the early 1900s, Laura just started writing like a newspaper column in a Missouri newspaper about farm life topics. She wrote a lot about how to like keep really good chickens and get really good eggs, I think, but you know, that sort of thing. Then, so she'd been writing this newspaper column for several years. I think she actually stopped for a while in the 20s. She was getting older. She would have been like in her 50s then, maybe. And her daughter, Rose, was actually a big journalist and writer as well. That's sort of how Laura got into it. Her daughter was like, hey, this is a great way to make some money to help support your farm, which is not really financially viable. So Laura did that for many years. And then during the Great Depression, her daughter was also going through a Great Depression, but of the mental health variety, and unable to work. So Laura was sort of like, well, someone's got to support this family. I might be 60, but it's time to become an author. Her daughter Rose had the idea that they could write up her mother Laura's memoirs and sell them as children's books, basically to support the family. So that's what they did. The books are published between 1932 and 1943, and as they say, the rest is history. They've become huge bestsellers, classics across the world. They're really seen as like the emblem of that time period, I think, especially for a lot of children. Like for a lot of people, I think they're the first and maybe only introduction they have to that period of history and that experience. So, Prairie Fires, The American Dreams of Laura Ingalls Wilder, is like a biography of Laura and of her work, because obviously she wrote her works during her life. Duh. But yeah, now we're gonna add the egg and talk a bit about how I first came into contact with the Little House on the Prairie books, which is, that's the name I know the series as. I probably should have checked this before filming, but I think that's like the name that most people know the series as. So I have my egg. I did not take this from a chicken in my backyard because I live in an apartment and don't have a backyard. But if I had one, I would have done that for Laura's sake. But instead I bought this at the grocery store. So we're gonna add the egg, and I don't really remember a time when these books weren't in my life, to be perfectly honest. I know my mom read them when she was a child, and then I feel like I probably had them read to me when I was quite young. I think I have a memory of like one of my grandmothers reading them out loud to me, but I don't know if that's a true memory or one that I just sort of invented in my head. Anyways, we had the whole series when I was a kid on like the bottom level of the bookshelf where all the kids' books were. And once I learned to read, I read them multiple times. I feel like they were one of those, you know when you're a kid and you just reread stuff continuously? They were one of those series for me, so I read them a lot. But honestly, I sort of grew out of them probably around the time I was 10 or so, I guess, and haven't really thought about them since. Prairie Fires, The American Dreams of Laura Ingalls Wilder by Caroline Fraser is basically a biography that looks at Laura's life not from the perspective of her books, which we'll touch on later, but from the perspective of like actual historical fact and like census records and land deeds and letters and diaries that were kept and all that sort of thing. And also looks at the process of writing her books and how that came to happen. Obviously, she wrote them during her life. We're going to add the molasses now and talk a bit about the book that I'm reviewing today. So, Prairie Fires really gives the more adult take on her life story. There's no glossing things over, there's no, you know, skipping out the worst parts for the sake of the kids type stuff. It's no holds bars. We really see how on the brink of poverty her family was for her childhood and for a lot of their early marriage. At one point, they like fled town in the night because they were so overwhelmingly in debt that they knew they couldn't get out of it, so they just sort of walked out on that and resettled hundreds of miles away. And as I said earlier, she started working really young and worked really hard her whole life, including after her marriage. So she and her partner, when she got married, she sort of thought like, okay, this is it, we're set, I'm gonna live a more comfortable life, like, he's got it all taken care of. And then a few years into their marriage, her husband, Alonzo, revealed that like, oh no, we're in crazy debt. I've been taking out tons of mortgages against our property and like borrowing a shit ton of money, and we're dead broke. And from the sounds of what was written in unpublished documents and stuff, that was a really difficult thing for her to go through. She thought that like that period of her life was over, but it wasn't. And actually they only started to really make progress in getting out of debt and building their way towards financial stability went thanks to a gift from Almanzo's dad before he died that paid off their mortgage on their property in Missouri. And that sort of not having that debt repayment allowed them to start to like climb their way up and become more prosperous. But throughout all of this, we really see just how hard and how tirelessly Laura worked to support the people around her and support her family, both her birth family and then her family that she created when she got married. And it's just really, really remarkable to see the resilience she had and the amount of labor and effort and just not giving up that she had. There's so many points where you just go like, how is she going to keep doing this? And she does. She just keeps working. She keeps pulling forward. And so that was really interesting. And I feel like in a weird way, because the children's books are made for children, we don't see that side as much. And this book really highlighted that. That was awesome. I loved reading about that side of her. This book focuses a lot both on Laura and on her daughter Rose, for a reason I will get to later. But it was really interesting to read about their political views and their increasingly radical political views in the 1930s in response to the New Deal. So Rose especially, but Laura as well, were quite libertarian. And I feel like this book does a really good job of presenting them very neutrally throughout the book. It doesn't try and necessarily fit their politics or their views into left or right by today's standards, except for Rose, who was like one of the founding members of libertarianism in the US. So you can't really get away from classifying her, but like she classified herself. So that was really interesting, and it's really interesting to see why Laura made the changes in her books that she did. And basically, throughout the books, we see all of her father's failures as things that were caused by other people. It was never his fault that they were in debt. It was never his fault that their farm was failing. It was never his fault that they had to move again. Basically, he's the dad who can do no wrong. But at the same time, in her non-children's book writing and in her correspondence with people, Laura is so harsh of all sorts of people who find themselves in exactly the situation her family did and exactly the situation her father was in. And it's all their fault, and they shouldn't get any assistance because it's 100% their fault. Never mind that at multiple points in her childhood, they relied on government assistance to feed them because their farm was failing so badly. That was due to weather issues, but like, she had this weird sort of thing of like, it's never our fault, but everyone else it is their fault, which, frankly, when you read about her childhood and the stuff that we considered pretty traumatic by today's standards, which were obviously seen as like normal and that's just how things worked back then, but like, I'm sure it was still very traumatic even if they didn't have the words to talk about that. But yeah, basically she, in her writing, seemed to feel like she needed to right the wrongs that she perceived against her family and set the record straight and set their lasting memory the way she wanted it to be seen, not necessarily the reality that it was. So that was really interesting. I'd read before that her books were not very accurate, that they'd really been skewed to reflect her later opinions. She was writing them during the Great Depression and was widely influenced by that, but I was never really sure how or in what way. So this book was a really great way of looking at this and seeing, okay, what was her childhood actually like, and then what was her mindset during the writing process and why did she make the changes that she did. I forgot to mention on camera that I was doing this, but I've mixed together my dry ingredients. God, this makes so many dishes, but oh well. So I mixed together my dry ingredients, I've drained my coconut. Okay, so we're mixing together all the wet and dry ingredients now, and I thought I would tell you a bit about the other thing that I really appreciated about this book, which is how much detail it goes into and how much explanation it gives of what was happening in the world around their story. So this was a thing more so in the first half of the book for me because I feel like I'm more acquainted with, you know, the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl, World Wars, all of that stuff. I'm fairly familiar with that part of history. But I honestly didn't know too much about the economic and meteorological situation in the sort of second half of the 1800s in the US. And that was really fascinating. So if you've read the Little House on the Prairie books, you might remember, I think it's On the Banks of Plum Creek, there's a chapter where locusts descend on the farm, and essentially these grasshoppers eat everything for like miles around. Everything, all of the crops are destroyed. And that was obviously really interesting to read in those books as a kid. It was, wow, this is crazy. But it was so interesting to read about the larger effect and how this wasn't a thing that was limited to their farm or their area, and it talks about like what was going on all over the US and the Midwest and stuff. Is that the Midwest? I feel like maybe that's just the West. I don't know, American geography confuses me. So it talks about that, it talks about the various droughts and what was going on the large scale. It talks about how at the time when the Dakotas were being settled, when it was still called Dakota Territory, there was all of this false propaganda of like, guys, it's gonna be amazing. We're all gonna be rich. The land is amazing. You cannot fail to farm this. And that wasn't true at all. There was a few large-scale farmers with the ability to invest in lots of land and capital along riverbanks who were having massive success, but the average farmer who was working with very basic equipment and no money to buy more in the non-Riverlands territory, just like it wasn't possible to make as much as they thought it was going to be. And before the territory was even settled, there were, I can't remember if he was a geologist or a climatologist, but there was a person in that sort of field who was like, guys, you're gonna find that you're mistaken. This is not gonna work out for you. Don't do this. But everyone was so excited about the like, no, it's gonna be great. All of these people who don't have farms and aren't well off in, I guess, the Midwest, they're gonna move west, they're gonna have farms, they're gonna be rich. It's gonna be awesome. Don't listen to this guy, he's wrong, he doesn't know what he's talking about. Except, of course, he was totally right, and all of these farmers were barely scraping by, and their farms were failing, and they were so dependent on the price of grain, which of course is so tied to the ability to produce grain. So once they all had a bumper crop and they were like, great, we can sell our grain, it's gonna be awesome. Everyone, oh, no one's willing to pay for this because everyone had a bumper crop this year. So that side was really interesting. I thought it really put into perspective the ordeals that the Ingalls family and then the Wilder family went through. And it really made you realize how large scale these problems were, and that her story is just the one story out of many like it that happened to get written down and happened to get really big and everyone's read it. But they weren't a unique experience. That was the reality of life in those areas at that time. So that was super cool, so fascinating. Now, I've stirred together all of my ingredients, but honestly, my batter does not look as thick as the one in the photo from this vlog. And like, I'm not gonna get balls out of this. This is too wet. I don't know if maybe my molasses was wetter. Can molasses be different levels of wetness? I don't know what's going on. Maybe I didn't strain my coconut enough, but I'm gonna go off-piste and add a bit of extra flour to this to try and get it to a better consistency. It was definitely too easy to stir the dry ingredients into the wet, which I feel like in cookies is a sign that your ratio is off. If you can do it comfortably by hand, you probably need more dry. So we're gonna do that. Okay, I've got a consistency that feels more appropriate now. I think I can like roughly shape this without it just like falling apart everywhere. It's a bit more thick and sticky now. My arms are feeling appropriately sore. So what I'm gonna do is clear up all of these bowls that I have spread in front of me gloriously to the side of the sink so that I can wash them later. And then we're gonna roll them into balls. So that sounds good. Then we can bake them. Editing Rosie here because apparently the file that contained this bit of voice on my camera corrupted. So that was disappointing. But basically, the only part of this book that I wasn't totally sure about was the amount of time spent on Rose, Laura's daughter. And at parts, it reads more like a biography of her than her mother, which it is required because they lived incredibly enmeshed lives. At many points in their life, Rose was simultaneously sending her parents money and borrowing money from her parents.
but I just wasn't looking to read a biography about her. And I don't know what was going on in her head. I know she suffered from severe depression throughout her life. She may have been suffering from other mental illness. But based on her own actions and the things she said and wrote, she just wasn't a person I was at all interested in reading about or knowing more about. She was really hypocritical. She didn't seem to ever be able to learn from her mistakes. Everything was always someone else's fault. At one point late in her career, when she wasn't publishing books so much, it wasn't because her books weren't selling well or her books weren't resonating. It was because of a communist plot to stop her from publishing. So that part just wasn't as interesting to me. But it was essential for the book, because she did edit her mother's books and have a really big influence there.
And I'm back. For you, it's been no time at all, but I baked the cookies and cooled the cookies and all that happened. Made some tacos, had some lunch, and now the cookies are done and I've tasted one, and I can confirm they're pretty good. Oatmeal coconut molasses isn't necessarily my favorite. I probably would have just done molasses or done oatmeal chocolate chip, but my partner loves them because he loves coconut, so that's awesome. Here, I'm gonna try and do the beauty vlogger thing. See if I can do this. Wait, I don't know if I have autofocus on. I don't have autofocus on, but hopefully you can see the cookie. They're pretty cute. And also, let's wrap up this review. It's very confusing doing two things at once. I hope this hasn't been too jumping all over the place. As I said in my TBR for the History Challenge, which I don't know if I mentioned at the beginning, I don't think I did. I actually read this book as part of the History Challenge, which is a readathon. I'll link my TBR above. I'm still figuring out which side it is. I wasn't sure if the original Little House on the Prairie series was fiction or memoir. I was sort of like, is it a novel? Is it a memoir? Which is it? I don't know. And it turns out I'm not the only one, and I'm not wrong for being confused. They were sold as novels. That's what they were marketed as. That's what they were sold as. But Laura and Rose insisted that they were all true, even though parts of them were clearly edited and anyone could see that, like, no, that doesn't line up. That can't be true. You have to be changing stuff here. On the whole, I thought it was an fascinating book. I'm easily interested, so maybe this wouldn't be interesting to other people who aren't already interested in Laura Ingalls and her life. But if you read these books as a kid, I think it's super worthwhile picking up. It's really interesting to hear, yeah, the real side of it. The not sugarcoating, not hiding the dark secrets in the closet side of it. If you've read it, let me know down below in the comments. If you're interested in reading, let me know. Did you read the Little House on the Prairie series as a kid? Did you watch the TV show? I feel like a lot of people will know about this, but maybe I'm wrong. Anyway, if you liked this video, please hit the like button down below. If you would like to see more of my videos, please hit the subscribe button, and thank you for watching!